Welcome back to Orthodox Family Life. Today we have a special guest with us, Father John Valadez. Father John is the rector of St. Timothy Antiochian Orthodox Church in Lompoc, California, and currently runs the Death to the World ministry online. So, welcome, Father John.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. You're the very first priest I've had on, so I'm excited and a little nervous.
Well, thank God. Thank
Yeah.
God.
Well, today I wanted to talk about family life, which I know is not the normal topic that you cover. Most of the interviews you've done have been about death to the world and about maybe leaving the punk scene and coming into orthodoxy. So maybe we could just start there really briefly, so that if people are new to you, they understand where you're coming from.
Sure. Um, yeah, I was born and raised in Southern California, um, and probably a non-traditional family, though. Unfortunately, it's becoming more of a tradition not to have a traditional family. Um, my mother and father were separated before I was born. So I was kind of born into a divided household, if you will. And I think, especially as a young teenager, that left a lot of questions up in the air, left me questioning society a lot. And I went really heavily into the punk rock scene throughout middle school and especially in high school. But I had some friends there that eventually were involved in some Protestant churches, and some Protestant bands that were punk bands, but they had Protestant lyrics and things like that. And so, thankfully, I was kind of saved out of more of the dark corners of the punk scene that many
Mhm.
people fall into, and eventually found Orthodoxy through a Bible study that I was going to at a tattoo parlor. We were looking for the historical church, and when you do that, you run into the church eventually. And so I found Orthodoxy about 6 months after graduating high school. So I was 18 and baptized when I was 19, in 2005. And yeah, that's kind of, I mean, that really marked a huge change, a pivot in my life.
Yeah, I can totally relate. I've told my story, the long version, so I won't tell that.
Mm,
But I my parents never divorced, but my mother was pretty severely mentally ill, so there's a
mm,
lot of um, difficulties in the family, which just kind of disintegrated around me. So by the time I'm 17, I was living on my own and supporting myself going to high school. And so I found that the church during my senior year, and I ended up getting baptized, turned 18, and dropped out of high school all within about 2 weeks. So it was pretty dramatic. And,
yeah, yeah,
you know, so I totally get that. I used to have pink hair and a nose ring and red Doc Martens, oxblood Doc Martens, and the
yeah,
whole thing. So there are a lot of people that have come out of the punk scene. So
yeah.
um, what do you think that's all about? What do you think the punk scene, like? Why is there that punk to Orthodox pipeline?
I think the pipeline is there, and it's kind of a constant pipeline, it seems like, throughout the years, because there's something in the punk scene, I think, that is trying to grapple with reality, you know. And there's a sort of asceticism, I guess you could say, to the punk lifestyle,
Mhm.
um, guarding oneself from media, or guarding oneself from even certain brands, or even a diet, and all these kinds of things that people are trying to find truth in. They're trying to find something to devote their life to, in their rebellion against what they see as this fake plastic world that's deceiving them and constantly letting them down. And the church offers a real rebellion, a true rebellion. And
Mhm.
um, I remember first cracking open the lives of the saints and seeing these writings from early monastics about leaving the world, and the deceit of the world, and those really resonated with me. A lot of those words really resonated with me, and so I think that it definitely answers a lot of questions that people in the punk scene are trying to grapple with.
Yeah, and that question of identity too, of like, who am I? I noticed that when I became Orthodox, I began to see that the punk rock scene itself was plastic on some level. It was just all
Yeah,
vanity. So I
yeah,
remember, going out and buying like a pink dress from the thrift store, something I would never have worn, wouldn't have been caught dead in, and just kind of embraced like I don't know how to put it, like, maybe normal, like, radical normality or something, which was a real
yeah,
change for me. Like, I identified for so many years with a certain look, it was really hard to shed that.
yeah. Yeah, and even in the scene, if you don't have your mohawk the right way, or you're wearing a
Mhm.
different jacket, or you got your band shirt from the mall store, you're like shunned.
Yeah,
So it
exactly.
becomes its own, yeah, like you said, a plastic society. Yeah,
But there's a lot of good people that are, like you said, searching for the truth, and I
absolutely.
think that living in that world for a while definitely helped me to be a Christian, to be not scared of being on the outside or maybe being used to being on the outside and, um being different, instead
Yeah,
of always going with the flow.
yeah. I think God definitely uses it as a training ground for a lot of us before we encounter a real spiritual life. There's a lot of things obviously that had to be learned, and a lot of rewiring to be done, but at least the connections were there that could be made. You know,
Mhm. So when you became Orthodox, you were still single?
I was, yeah,
You
yeah,
were, and then eventually you got married, right?
yes,
And you have a family now,
yeah.
which is wonderful.
My wife, Pastor Christina, and we have 5 kids here. So we're gonna celebrate our 13th anniversary in next month, in just about
Wonderful.
today. Yeah. So
Thank God.
yeah, I with that, like you said, the identity sort of crisis that we've maybe we're grappling with in the punk scene. I think once I came over to Orthodoxy, I was still grappling with it a bit, in who I was, where I came from, why am I here, type of a thing, but
Mhm,
in an Orthodox way. So, what's my call in life? Do I go to a monastery? Do I um, stay in the world? And, what exactly is my purpose? And where's my family? I think that was another thing. Like, where was
mhm,
my family? And I think I found a lot of um, a lot of the father figures in the monastery.
mhm,
That really helped me help guide me on a spiritual direction. I have my father, obviously, that I'm close to, my stepfather, as well, but no father figure as far as the spiritual life goes.
mhm,
I learned how to do, I guess, automotive work and plumbing and these kinds of exterior things, maybe around the house or with the cars or whatever. But as far as spiritual life, that was something non-existent. So, and that was really pivotal for me. Meeting now Bishop Gerasim of
mm,
Fort Worth. He was the abbot of Saint Herman of Alaska Monastery in Platina here in California. And he was the first one who sent me a box full of Death to the World magazines and prayer ropes and things like that. And we corresponded back and forth. And he would come and stay at my godfather's house from time to time, or monks did if they came to Los Angeles. And so some of us young adults would go over there and be able to talk to them. And I started making trips basically every month to Platina, and later the monks helped me go to Alaska and stay there for a month or two at a time in the summers, just to see what my vocation was, but that formation, that spiritual formation from a father figure, especially in the person of Bishop Grossum, was extremely pivotal in my life,
Mm.
to really help direct me and form me as a person, in a way that I don't think I could have gotten, um, from my earthly father figures, because there's no really Christianity in the home. Um, Even my stepfather was pretty hostile, towards Christianity when I first became a Protestant as a teenager. Um, my biological father a little bit. He's never been hostile, but just sort of indifferent in some ways. Though I think there's something there. There's some seed there. But um, yeah, meeting the monks and and being able to look at my life in a different way, and really being guided by by them, also by my parish priest, my two parish priests, was was something invaluable. That I will always treasure those relationships and those first conversations, for life, definitely.
I think there's so many people now who are new to the church. Obviously, we have this wonderful wave of converts coming in, and a lot of people resonate with, your story and are in that position of trying to discern if they should be married or monastic, or maybe there's some that wanna be married and they're having trouble finding, right,
Mm-hmm.
a spouse or
Mm-hmm.
potential spouse. So, do you think people I guess some people already kinda have a sense of one or the other that they want, but there's a lot of people that don't. So I guess 2 questions is how do people who don't have a sense of which way they should go process that? But what happens to people if they do wanna get married and they, are in the situation now so many are where they maybe they feel like they can't find a spouse, but they're also very broken. Like, I know for me, it took many years to work through just some of the most basic healing in
Mm-hmm.
the church.
Um, I really think that it's not only not only doesn't seem like it's traditional within Orthodox, throughout Orthodox history, it's also it's also a really good, um, I guess, route for people like this is to really visit monasteries, and with a blessing to try to stay at monasteries for, uh, a period of time, or just work at monasteries for a period of time, or
Mm,
whatever it may be, because you can try out monasticism. You really can't try out marriage. You
good
can become
point.
you become a novice at a monastery, but once you're married for life.
Yeah.
Um, but but also the monastery does a few things. I think that it really does train a person. It rounds a person out and trains them to be a good spouse. You know,
Mhm,
At the monastery, you learn how to be self-sufficient in many ways, but at the same time, being rounded out by the people around you and their own personalities, and being taught to submit your will, to somebody else, and to crucify your ego. And you learn to cook. You learn to be,
mhm,
hands-on with things. You learn to work hard. You begin to understand the value of praying every day and having a constant prayer rule, and submitting to that prayer rule, and no matter what happens during that day or how tired you are, or there's so many great valuable lessons that can be learned by just being around monastics. And um, it helps one to be a good spouse. It helps one to be a good spouse. And the other thing too is that usually people who are seeking a good spiritual life, or um, a deeper spiritual life, are visiting the monasteries as well.
mhm.
So I think that it's a much better place to meet people than it is, maybe even in some parish events and things like that, because it takes a sort of dedication, I think, and a will and a want to have a deeper prayer life, to stay at a monastery for a length of time. And I've met great friends just by visiting monasteries. I've known people who have met their spouses, at monasteries when they were on their own pilgrimages there. So it's a wonderful place to round yourself out, to make yourself a better spouse, a better Christian, and wait for God's will to happen. I know that in many cases it's hard to be patient, but God really does answer prayers, and
Mm.
we have to be, I guess, willing and open for His timing.
Yeah, it's really difficult, but
Yeah,
it's really true.
it is. It is. It
And,
is.
I also had some relationships with different monasteries here in California, the, um, Our Lady of Kazan and then, here in Dunlap, where I ended up moving. But, and that was so pivotal, and Metropolitan Jonah was a friend, so we would go to
Mm,
Point Reyes or, uh, Manton, and I think about those times, everything you said where you learned, you know, um, kind of bumping up against each other, right? Yourself is exposed and all, but it was in the context of such great love that you could bear it. Like,
mm-hmm,
when it can be hard in the world, right? Where you feel exposed, like, with the essence of who you are to other people, and it can be a pretty tough place, right? There's not a lot of
mm-hmm.
that kind of love in the world, right? That still loves you, still accepts you, and I think for me, that was such a great lesson, and it's the same in marriage, right? Where you
Yeah,
become more and more open to one another,
yeah,
but it's in that context of love.
yeah, 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 absolutely. Yeah, I think of even things like in the life of Saint Joseph the Hesychist and the disciples, and how sometimes there would be things that were totally not logical, yet in obedience they would follow them, and great fruition would come from it. Like whether it be, they were planting onions upside down, and instead of talking back against the elder, they just decided to plant the onions upside down, and then lo and behold, all these beautiful onions come up. Something totally illogical, yet because the will is crucified, the ego is crucified, then God is able to move and to work. And uh, there's there's such a beauty to, if one has a blessing to spend a length of time at or around a monastery, because it instead of it being a place of pilgrimage, it kind of takes on a different feel. You start to, oh, like monks or nuns can be grumpy sometimes, and this or that, but or this person rubs me the wrong way or something like that, and you don't get that when you just visit for a day or two.
It gets
But
real.
it gets real. It becomes real life, but then when you're in church
Yeah.
every day and you're praying together every day and you're asking for forgiveness every day, and all of those kinds of things, it really smooths out your rough edges, and you start to realize, well, I'm kind of the problem, not this other
Mhm.
person. That's a
That's a
really good
hard
lesson
pill
to
for
learn.
us all to swallow,
Yeah.
which we've all had to do. But, I don't know about you, but I feel like when I first came into the church and, especially as we're talking about coming from a broken family, um, or, kind of a broken situation, you do just have so much to work through, so much brokenness. It can kind of drive you to the edge of despair. You start to think, "Am I ever gonna be healed? Is it even possible to be healed?" You know?
Hmm.
And, what would you say to people that have that almost inclination towards despair over when they begin to see who they really are?
um, I there has to be a real hope and dependence on Christ. I think we read in the Fathers and in so much monastic literature to condemn oneself, um, to really have this a brutal self-examination, and be honest with who you truly are and these sorts of things. But it really has to be done with a hope in the mercy of Christ, because without it, one can fall into they can be deceived by themselves, and
Mhm.
despair in many ways can become very um, prideful, even though we don't think of it that way. It becomes all self-loathing about oneself. Um, Whereas when we read about these things in monastic literature and in the writings of the church about the spiritual life, it's always in the context of a hope in the mercy of God, right? That
Mhm.
I cannot complete this, but the Lord will help me. The Lord fills the things that are lacking. We even say this the bishop says this in the prayer over a priest when a priest is ordained, that the Holy Spirit fills that which is lacking. We have to have trust in God that He will fill those gaps. And in time, through struggle, we will be rounded out. We can achieve healing, if we rely on His mercy. And I think there's so much within our culture that we're raised with this idea that we can do everything ourselves, or we should do everything ourselves,
Mhm.
and we should be self-sufficient, and all these other kinds of things. We don't need other people really to help us to become who we are, or to have a fulfilling life if we just follow our desires. All these kinds of things we hear. um, and when we try to live out asceticism on our own terms and by our own strength, it never works out very well, you know. But if we go into it knowing, okay, we're gonna fall, we're gonna skin our knees, and we're gonna get a little bit bloody, but the Lord will always be there as the Good Samaritan to pick us up and to bind the wounds and to bring us to the priest for confession and these kinds of things. And it's so pivotal to have, a good spiritual father and a good and maybe even a good spiritual mother, to help to bind those wounds and to help us navigate, this life so that we don't fall into um, darkness and despair and this uh, self-loathing that so many people find themselves in, that can really just be a prison.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember many years ago sharing with, my spiritual mother about must have been some struggle with the kids and thinking just kinda being exasperated and sharing, I I can't do this, like, it's just I'm failing, I cannot do this, and she kinda looked at me like, "Well, like, of course you can do this. Why did you think you could do this? Like, Christ is doing this." Like,
Yeah,
that's a silly thought, there wasn't that's why I love the sisters from, the 2 monasteries that we're kinda close with. It's these things can be kinda heavy, seeing ourselves for what we are, but
yeah.
they just have a lightness about it, like, "You silly goose, of course you can't do it. That's a funny thing," And,
Yeah.
it's such a good attitude. It's always so encouraging to see how the sisters are always so Christ focused instead of
Mm.
me focused, whether that's me, I'm
Mm.
so great, or me, I'm so terrible. It's still
Mhm.
me,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
and you just see them being so focused on God that they just forget about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I really asked you to speak about family life, but I felt like this was important because to cover everything we just talked about, because these issues come up again when you're raising children, I think. When I first converted, it was very hard to bear who I was, that realization. And I felt
Mm.
like it was kind of a second wave when you start having kids because there's this added,
Yeah.
level of intensity and asceticism to being a parent.
Yeah. I didn't know how
And
impatient I was. I didn't know how
right?
it brings it all.
Or or do I want my kids to behave so that everyone thinks well of us? Or do I want them to behave
Mm.
because this is the right thing to do. It gets
Mhm.
pretty real.
Yeah.
Um, so what can we give to parents who have that feeling of brokenness and they're coming to the church, whether or not they already have kids? How can we encourage them in being parents? Like, what is the most central things we can give to them?
Well, it is its own, like you said, asceticism. In the marriage service, we have the crowning, and that's not only to for the church to anoint and to display these two people as a king and queen of their own household, this royal priesthood that the Lord talks about, but also their crowns of martyrdom. Their crowns of martyrdom, and on that day of marriage, though in many cases it's the best day of a person's life. At the same time, it's also sort of the end of their life in that they don't live for themselves, but they live for another person. They're rounded out by this other person, and they crucify themselves for this other person. A a holy monk once told my wife and I, the whole point of marriage is to enable your spouse to become a saint, and that takes a lot of self crucifixion, a lot of self denial. And so, like I said before, with the whole falling into despair thing, it's so important to have a spiritual father, preferably the same spiritual father that you're able to um, go through life with and navigate marriage with and navigate parenthood with, um, so that we don't fall into these narrow cracks, and we can stay on a sure path, because there because when two broken people come together in marriage, there's a lot of things to be worked out and a lot of humility that has to be had. And then, like you said, then this nether wave comes when a child comes into the house,
Mhm.
uh, because there's there's more crucifixion, there's more self-denial, there's a change in the program, there's a flexibility that maybe one person has, another person doesn't, or whatever it may be. So all of these things are so important to have a spiritual father to help to navigate through, a closeness to some monasteries to help navigate through, so that families can take trips to monasteries and learn things from the monasteries, learn things from their spiritual father, to be in church as much as possible,
Mhm.
even if it is the hardest thing to do, to get everybody ready to be in church. I know that for the first few years of my first and second, but after that, it's all my wife. My wife is the saint in that regard of getting everybody ready. I'm at the church quietly doing proskymedia while while all the kids are running
Yeah,
around because they can't find their shoes, or crying because they can't buckle their seatbelt, or whatever it may be,
right.
or threw
It's
up
the
in the
real
car on the
struggle.
way to church. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And,
yeah.
it's easy as a parent. I mean, I've definitely been there with 4 kids. Like, it's easy to worry about the externals. We must be there on time. We must have all these, like, which is it's good to be there on time. But I kinda started thinking maybe it's better to just keep peace in the family this morning, and we get there when we get there, but we just try to be peaceful, we try to be patient, we try to find
Mhm.
everyone's shoes. It's a real struggle to kinda balance that
Yeah.
you know, um I think it took me a long time, but now I feel like I prioritize the peace, and it's like if we're not meeting a certain standard, it's okay, but we have peace. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, yeah, it does, and I know it's a really beautiful goal to have, um, because we want our kids not to think of Sunday morning as a crazy, difficult, stressful time, but that time of peace where the whole family can be praying together in the church.
Mhm. And I know that I always leaned more towards the right, maybe a bit, you stand up straight, you stand up the whole time and, being,
Hmm.
a little too a little too much of that. And so being maybe exposed to the more Greek way of there's like all this freedom, the kids come and go and they're laying on the floor and, it's a
Yeah,
really
yeah,
beautiful
yeah.
thing. Like I really needed that to kind of,
Mm.
soften my approach with my own children. And um forgive me, I just lost my train of thought. But it's
No, it's a good. That's a great thought. That's a great thought.
I know that Yarndisa here, she was talking to someone who, we have these all night vigils, right? They start at 7 p.m. and they go to like 1 a.m.
Yeah,
And these
yeah,
people that bring all their children and they just bring their little blankets and they hunker down.
yeah.
And she came over once and she said something like, "Oh, it's so bring them like it's wonderful. It's like a giant hug of Panagia, of the Mother of God. They're just
Mhm.
in her embrace." And I kind of going back to the thing I said about to my spiritual mother about letting go of you know, what I'm trying to do here and just being in the moment with your kids, learning to be peaceful and understanding that God is actually raising your kids for you. It's not,
Yeah.
I always felt like maybe I was driving the train too much and I should just be in the caboose or something. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, and those are great. Those are great reflections. Definitely, definitely, and hopefully they're encouraging to families who struggle to bring their children or to be consistent in the church and things like that. As if we're in the church, at least the grace of God is washing over us in a really
Mhm.
powerful way there. Even if we're bumps on a log or whatever, the grace of God is washing over everyone. Even if you're going in and out of the church 40 times because because you have a troublesome child that day or something like that, the grace
Yeah.
of God is washing over, and a great blessing comes from the Lord when we're making that sacrifice and that struggle as well. You know.
Yeah. Do you have a word for mother that's there? Because that's most mothers of young children, that's where they are. You feel like you spent all this time getting everyone ready and in the car to church. And then you're
Yeah.
in the narthex the whole time, You're
Yeah.
like, "Why
Yeah.
am I even here?"
Yeah.
For me, it was like a decade of being in the
Yeah.
narthex.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does
My
it
wife,
matter?
yeah,
Should they give up?
my wife basically hasn't heard like a homily of mine in many years,
Yeah.
um, but you should not give up. Keep coming, and it kind of goes back to what we had talked about before, the monastery kind of preparing one for even married life and even parenthood, because especially in smaller monasteries, you may notice nuns going in and out or monks going in and out of church because they're working in the refectory, or um, they're taking care of guests or whatever it may be, and they're in and out in their own obediences. And the same thing is with mothers who have those kids that they're in and out, in and out, in and out with. It's a blessed obedience. Sometimes in the altar itself, when a young man or a young boy is working as an altar server, they're not paying attention the whole time, and because there's things that have to be done. They have to make sure that they're here for the censer, and I mean the goal is to be praying the whole time when we do these things, but at the same time there's an obedience that has to be fulfilled, and that becomes the prayer, right? It becomes the work of the divine liturgy. And so the same thing is with moms and their little kids. It becomes the work of the divine liturgy, and and it is blessed by God when we put in that effort.
Yeah, it's such a sacrificial act to do, and it's hard at the time because, to be in church is a good thing. It's good to be spiritually fed, but,
Yeah.
it's actually higher to be there for your children. It's a really hard lesson to learn for young mothers. I think
Hmm.
you can feel alone in the narthex, and like, maybe this wasn't worth it. Maybe why bother? Maybe just coming home
Yeah.
and, but,
Yeah.
um, it'll
Yeah.
it's just a season, it's that patience of learning
That's
this is not forever, you know?
that's right.
And
That's
you'll
right.
never regret taking your kids to church in the long run.
In the long
Maybe in
run.
the maybe in
Maybe
the short run.
maybe that day in the short run, but in the long run. That's right.
What does, Saint Sophrony say, when you're about to be overcome, have a cup of tea,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
calm down, it'll be okay. But, another situation I wanted to ask you about was, I know as a lot of young men are coming into the church, some of them are already married,
Hmm.
and maybe some of their, wives are not really interested in the church, and this is a very difficult situation to be in.
Hmm.
So what kind of encouragement could we give, for these men and women are often in the same situation?
Yeah. Uh, have patience. Again, hard thing to learn, and allow the church to change you. I think that's the biggest thing because usually, usually arguments and debates and things like this about orthodoxy and why it's the right way to go um, usually do more damage than they offer solutions. But when a spouse is transformed, when a spouse is changed, then that is what becomes evident in the household. And I think that's really the goal of our spiritual life anyways, to be changed, to become more like Christ, and to be consistent in the church and follow its teachings to the best of our ability. So we have to be patient with spouses that are not in the church yet, and also show them by an example of love and humility and a Christ-like attitude, a joyful attitude, at home and in the church itself. I think that's really the solution, though it's a hard one to follow for sure. You know.
It is, but that love and that patience, my husband was Orthodox when we got married, we both were, but I had to kinda have that patience with my parents, they ended up
Mm.
converting about 10 years after me, but it's always a temptation to provide very helpful information maybe or, very helpful perspective
Yeah.
but, I tried to always remember that, God didn't pressure me to come to church. He just allowed me in my own time to come, and that's really hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
When you love the person and you want, the church will give them so much joy,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
force it. Christ always respects our free will,
Yeah. Yeah.
which also kind of leads me to a question about children and that freedom. Because as parents, we do have to put some boundaries, some rules, but
Mm-hmm.
we also want to give our children the freedom to choose Christ, right? We're not trying to
Yeah.
shove
Yeah.
him down their throat. So,
Yeah.
how do we do that?
Yeah. To make Christ their own, you know, and not just ours that we give, but to make Christ their own. Um, I think, it all starts with that foundational life of prayer for sure, and the experience of Christ, not just in the church, but at home, to pray every day with our children, to help them and encourage them to go to confession from a really, really young age, so that they get in the routine of self-examination and um, knowledge of what are virtues, what are passions, from a young age, so they can start to decipher for themselves, not just us tell them what's going on, but to be able to decipher for themselves um, what passions they may have, and what they need to work on, and things like that. Um, confessions of children, as a priest, confessions of children are the most beautiful thing ever, because they weep over the things that we so often forget about and do all of the time. So it's really beautiful for children to come before God and have repentance, even over the what we would consider small things, but they consider to be big things because their souls are so pure. And so it helps them to keep that purity. It helps them to keep that purity and to experience Christ. Also, just our own example too, as parents, to not only, like I said, have a prayer life at home, but also to be acting out in a virtuous way at home. And when we don't act out in a virtuous way at home, and we're not good examples, that we have the humility to ask for forgiveness and to say, I didn't handle this the right way. I didn't handle this the way that Christ would have handled this. Please forgive me. I think that's missing in a lot of homes today too,
Mhm.
because we're not taught by our parents to, you know, kind of display our weaknesses. But we should be able to do those things because it teaches our kids also that they're going to fall and they're going to do some things wrong, but there's also an exit in confession, in humility before others, in asking for forgiveness, and it helps promote this selfless way of life, hopefully, within the household. And in that humility, Christ always reigns in a soul that's humble, you know. So I think that's a huge thing, is to begin from a young age. For those that come into the church and they already have older children, 12 years old or 13, or and later in their teens or whatever, it becomes more difficult. But it's good, at least if we have younger children, at least to begin to round them out a little bit. I know some parents really struggle to have their kids in church in a divine liturgy for 2 hours or so, and a lot of the times I've found out it's because they're on a screen all day at home, or
Um,
and but this is kind of the culture that people are raised in. It's not anybody's
mhm,
fault necessarily, but it's what they've been taught to do. So they can rest, they can have their time, and these kinds of things.
mhm,
But kids in front of screens. I mean, um, my generation that grew up in the late 80s and 90s, the same thing goes to the television, or
mhm,
sat in front of television for a long time. But now it's in everybody's pockets and it's accessible anywhere and things like that. So it's worse. But you know, to begin to cultivate a holy life at home by making, by mandating screens and or sorry, by mandating rules for screens and things like that, and helping to shape the attention span of our children in a life of prayer and things like that, and cultivating a church life at home, making the church a mini home. All those things really help, so that children know, like, okay, this is a holy time, and this is a time that we look at our icons, or this is the time we kiss our icons, this is the time we say prayers, this is when we light candles, this is when we do this, or this is when we're quiet for a little bit, things like that. Help to build a foundation, so that when one goes to church, there's a reference for their children to have.
mhm,
uh, or else it becomes really difficult if their only reference is constant movement on a screen, or
yeah,
video games or something like that. It's like taking a cold glass and putting it in boiling water when you go to the
mm,
liturgy. Just there's no reference point. And and many parents get frustrated with this, like, we sit still, be obedient, pay attention, these kinds of things, and it's hard for children who don't have that foundation at home. So that foundation at home is so incredibly important, and shaping that with advice of a spiritual father is so incredibly important.
Yeah, I love everything you just said, Father, and I think that the other thing about confession is, especially from a young age, is developing that actual relationship with a spiritual father, like, knowing that they love you,
Mhm.
because when you have teenagers I don't know if you have teenagers yet or not, Father?
Well, I'm on the brink. I'm on the brink. I
We'll be praying for you.
Thanks. Yeah,
But,
yeah,
you
our 5 kids are very close up together, so I'm gonna have an entire house of teenagers at some point. Yeah.
I love teenagers, by the way. I think they're fantastic. I really do. But, teenagers, don't wanna listen to their parents as often, and if you wait to, have that confessional relationship, then it sets up a strange paradigm with the child where it's like the mother says, "Oh, go to confession so you can hear father tell you what I tell you, he's gonna back
Yeah,
me up or something," you don't want that, but a real relationship that they understand, like, he's not gonna tell me what you said, it's private, it's personal,
yeah,
because your kids will make mistakes, and they always need to know there's a way back. There's always
yeah,
a way back,
absolutely.
that repentance, but, I also wanted to touch on the thing you said about screens because I one thing I've noticed about, your Instagram is that you do a lot of craft work, and this is something like working on cars and, building things, and I think this is a real antidote to the screen problem. The interactive screens now are way worse than the television that we grew up with,
Mhm.
and I watched a ton of television. I could sing all the theme songs from,
Yeah, yeah,
3:30 to 9:00,
yeah, yeah,
Gilligan's Island and
and
everything.
also the way everything is made, you know? Like,
Yeah.
there was rules sort of, when you or I were younger on how things were filmed,
Mhm,
there but now the cuts in cartoons and stuff, they're only a few seconds, so you're snapping back and forth between different things, and it
mhm.
definitely scatters the mind much more than it did
Yeah.
when we were younger.
I mean, that's the purpose is to capture your attention. I think have you heard of Cocomelon?
Yes,
Yeah, so
yes,
they actually the company that makes that actually sets little babies and toddlers in front of their shows and will play them, and they'll have another TV playing with just real life scenes, and as soon as the child turns away to look at the real life scene, they mark that spot because it wasn't exciting enough to keep their attention.
I
So
see.
that's, like, how refined,
Yeah,
these shows are for capturing and holding a child's attention,
yeah,
which with the spiritual life, it's all about attention. What can you give your attention to? And,
yeah, yeah,
but any
yeah. We read in the Father. Sorry, we read in
Mhm,
the Fathers
okay.
that Adam's mind was one pointed, before the fall. And
Mhm,
so a product of the fall is to have a scattered mind, and our world, like you said, is refining that scattered brain. Yeah.
but I think the craft that you, I know, do in your personal life and maybe with your kids, I don't know, I feel like that is a way to heal some of that is to and you see that in the monasteries, all the sisters have a something they make, some garden they tend or some handiwork. So,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts about that you could share?
Yeah, I think it is a real antidote. I found it to be in my personal life, and then in especially the lives of young men, that come to the church and maybe have been, spending hours on video games.
Mhm,
Even grown men now spend hours on video games every day and things like that, and sometimes don't have physical jobs. And but getting them out and working on something and put their hand to something and building something is really a great antidote, because not only do you have time to quiet your mind, but you're also building something that has an end result with your hands.
mhm.
That digital life doesn't provide at all. So there's a sort of confidence, a healthy confidence that's built in it, but also a way to be quiet, to pray in many ways, and
Mhm.
to figure something out, to use the brain that God has given us to problem solve, and find solutions for Yeah, so I build car. I have my dad. I My dad built Volkswagens when I was young.
Mhm,
He had a Volkswagen when I was young, and so I just recently got back into
mm,
rebuilding those, and taking apart engines and learning how to put them back together because I needed something to sort of zone out, but not zone out on a screen.
mhm,
And in many ways, you can zone out when you're doing things like that in a healthy way that's productive, rather than being lost and re-educated by these phones that we keep in our pockets all of the
mhm.
time. Um, so I found to be healthy. There's 4 guys now at the parish that bought cars to work on. So thankfully they're hopefully in their garages more working on things and turning a wrench rather than sitting on their phone,
Mm.
or in front of a video game console or something like that.
Yeah. This is something else we share in common, fathers, our love for Volkswagens. Because my first car was a
Oh, was it?
'77 bus, yeah.
Oh,
I really wanted
wonderful.
a '65, but couldn't afford one, so I got the '77, and my husband's first car was the same actually, so,
Oh, great. That's
but,
great.
drove to see the Cranberries driving that a long time ago,
Oh.
a very long time ago. But yeah, I've started, not one of the kind of fallouts from my own upbringing was an utter lack of skills, both of,
Mm,
homemaking skills, but also just not knowing how to do anything. And I think something you touched on was everyone younger than us, I think, is in that situation. So I feel like we're in
yeah.
a
Yeah.
unique situation to encourage people. You can learn these things.
Yeah.
You can learn how to do anything. You just have to start and know that you're going to have some failure, and
Yeah.
but you feel so much more alive at the end of sewing a dress or something than you would have if you sat on Instagram and wished you were everybody else. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. And something you said, that loss of just knowledge in everyday life is really a product of how uh, our society has really fallen apart over the centuries. And so we feel that all of the time. Whether it be with medicine or with um, taking care of animals or building something, or you know fixing pipes or fixing this or fixing that, where our grandfathers and great grandfathers knew these things pretty well,
Mhm,
for the most part. And we've been stripped of a lot of that knowledge because of various, political movements or ideological movements that we can maybe, blame or pinpoint or whatever. But at the end of the day, we recovering some of that knowledge is really is really a beautiful thing to do. You know,
mhm.
we moved, our family moved out onto a few acres, a few 5 years ago now. We had no idea what it was like to like feed a chicken or to hold a wild bird or whatever it may be. You know, we made fun of ourselves for so long and still do. City folk trying to raise animals and things like this, and it was such a huge, drastic learning curve for us. And it was such a good learning curve because it forced us to be outside. It forced us to get up early in the morning.
Mm,
It forces us to do chores and take care of something else that
mm,
depends on us for its food and its shelter and all those kinds of things. And so it's so good for people to get back to working with their hands, to discover or rediscover some of these things that our ancestors had, and really, I guess, cultivate it. I think it's a really healthy thing,
mhm.
rather than certainly more healthy than the alternative of being hypnotized by all of these flashing things on the screen all of the
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Did you get in over your head?
Yeah, we did. We
We
have
did the
like
same
30,
thing.
we have like 30 ducks now and 30 chickens, a and a huge Great Pyrenees dog and 4 cats and yeah, 2 geese. And before we came here, I think we had like 3 fish in a fish tank.
We were the same. Dogs, cats, chickens, quail, rabbits, garden, orchard.
Yeah. We're
What
like,
are we doing?
and all of these songs from childhood started to make sense, and all these like sayings started to make sense, like sitting duck. Oh, that's because the ducks, they literally don't have any way to defend themselves, and they kind of sit there. We started to learn all of these things, like, oh, that's why old MacDonald had all these animals on his farm, because once you have a chicken, then you maybe need a dog to protect the chickens, and then, but then you have all these rats eating the chicken food, so you got to get cats to take care of the rats.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're there with you, Father. We're pulling back a little bit as our kids all leave home,
yeah,
but even if for us, the deer, our area here, the deer just eat everything. So,
yeah.
even
I
if
bet.
you just fail at it, just the process of doing it was so, so good for us. We learned so much. My boys built chicken coops and
Mm,
rabbit hutches and fencing and plumbing, for outdoor watering. It was
yeah,
such a really great experience for them. So,
yeah. Very wholesome,
mhm,
and going back to our early part of the conversation, those are things that I definitely came in contact with at the monastery too.
mhm,
Especially when I lived in the monastery in Alaska, because we didn't even have drinking water. We had to. My obedience was to hike down to the creek and fill up jugs of water and put them into a pack and hike back with them, so we had something. So we had water to drink for a few days. So that kind of stuff really helped to put life into perspective. Put
mhm.
life in perspective.
Yeah, there's a grounding effect about the whole thing. You
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, yeah,
for
and
sure.
it's not like homesteading is going to save your soul. You can
Mhm,
save your soul while you're homesteading, but it definitely it can be wholesome if we're doing it to to refine to refine those parts of our lives that are really defined by culture and the conveniences of society that numb the spiritual life. And there's something about manual labor and that suffering and the tiredness of the body and things like that
mhm,
help really push us, if we want to rely on Christ, rely on His strength, um, uh, rely on the saints for the protection of our animals and trees, and all these beautiful aspects of life that we have lost contact with because we're so attached to digital things that are not real, especially now
mhm.
with all this AI stuff coming out, and we don't know
Yeah,
what's real on a screen and what's not anymore.
mhm,
um, yeah, being attached to, like you said, being grounded to real earthly reality helps us to uh, have a good perspective on the spiritual life as well, I think.
mhm. And it doesn't have to be homesteading, it can be things in your house, woodworking
Oh
or,
yeah, absolutely.
whatever you
Yeah,
can do, yeah. But do
absolutely.
something real. Do something real.
Yeah, to knit, to build something, you know, whatever it may be, some electric work and
Mhm.
whatever. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Father. Any final thoughts about marriage and family life and
Um, Not much other than just to comment that marriage and family life is incredibly beautiful. It can definitely become a paradise. The Lord says that where two or three are gathered, He will be there. And for a married couple to be in unity, to have uh, a deep spiritual bond with their family, means that Christ is present. The family becomes an icon of Christ to the
Mhm,
world. It is so incredibly valuable. It's why our secular society hates family life so much and has in many ways tried to rid itself of big families and things, because holy families and any Christian family, any Orthodox Christian family that's really struggling to follow Christ and the commandments of His church become a great beacon of light, especially in dark and chaotic times that we find ourselves in. So
Thank you, Father.
while there's maybe many enemies or adversaries, there's so many great saints that we find kinship with, that are on our side.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention earlier, it's kind of providential we're speaking today, because Saint Olga will be
Yeah,
officially glorified this weekend,
yeah,
and she's our
yeah.
first, mother and woman and midwife, like the epitome of spiritual life in the home.
Yeah, and she stayed in one small village,
Mhm.
and she just did what she was called to do by God, and visit people and help people and raise children, and be a priest's wife.
And
And
knitted things for people.
exactly, and made things with her hands.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then that beautiful quote that is so, I think, relevant for our generation is, "God can create great beauty out of total destruction."
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
should be the quote for our generation, I think, Father,
It
just,
really should. Really
yeah.
should. It really should. Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming, Father. I've enjoyed our conversation. Where can people find you online?
Um, so I help to run a ministry called Death to the World. That's an outreach for um, people in the rock and punk subcultures are coming out of those things. So there's a website, deathtotheworld.com, that I could be found at.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, Father.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you.